what leads us to receive this divine grace? I have a beautiful quote from Kirpal Singh saying, "The divine grace is ever ready to pour itself into the vessel. But the vessel must first be ready. The vessel must first be empty. Become selfless," which means going beyond the ego I, going beyond the limitations of the limited self. And then grace is instantly here, receiving this special force that pours from divine, from God, from Satpurush, and from all the divine masters, gurus, sadgurus, and all the spiritual guides. Because it is not from the person, it has nothing to do with the person, it has nothing to do with the ego, with any limited identity of oneself. So what leads us to grace? What leads us to grace is the remembrance of God, is the devotion to God, to Source, to Divine. And it is also about aligning ourselves with the divine light and sound stream. These are two main aspects of how divine grace is redeemed. So divine grace orchestrates everything, though the ego often interferes. Though the ego's influence is temporary, eventually the I, me, myself, eventually it surrenders to the divine grace. Eventually, when it gets so exhausted, so tired of the constant struggles and the constant efforts and depletion of energy, when the ego is cornered and there's nowhere else to go, the ego, the identity, finally gives up, finally surrenders to the arms of the divine, and then divine grace pours down upon us, and we are uplifted, our spirit is uplifted, our karma is uplifted. It all happens by divine grace. So each action, each moment is imbued with the divine spirit. And yet we face the dualities, the conflicts of the mind and the ego, which obscure this beautiful grace, this beautiful force from divine. But when the mind softens, it creates a space for higher grace. The ego, it searches, it seeks for divine grace because it doesn't know any other better way. You see, the ego, the I, identity, it always tries to cling to what is familiar in all the familiar and habitual ways. So one that has the ego I interfering in the way would search for grace. What is grace? Where is grace? I don't comprehend grace, don't understand what it is. Because grace, divine grace, is beyond comprehension, beyond the understanding, the mind. This is why for some people it's mysterious how grace functions. So we must acknowledge that the mind's knowledge is limited, while God's grace is infinite. And we must learn to surrender and allow and recognize when we are blessed and when we are uplifted by divine grace. Many times, divine grace is present in one's life, but one is too busy to see it. One is too much intermingled with the unimportant things in the mundane life, too much intermingled with all the worries and concerns of the future. And thus, we miss out when divine grace is evidently present in our life. So the ego holds onto what it knows. But surrender, this leads to a higher grace and aligns us with divine's will. When we align ourselves with the will of God, even though one may not understand what that is, or one may not be able to really comprehend that, instead of having the ego I interfering in the way, you can surrender to the great unknown. You surrender to the unknown with the intention to align yourself with the will of God. That means even if you not know yet what that truly is. So our hearts, they must be free of pain and fears, to let love, the true love, the divine love, and the divine grace to shine forth. This allows us to open to God's will, to God's grace, and we allow God's grace to work through us and illuminating our path. So many times we find ourselves in conflict because we feel shaky when we don't know everything. When the ego is crumbling, one may suffer. One may experience a lot of anxieties and worries, because without knowing even, one tries to hold on to what it knows, because it is believed, ingrained deep within, that that is what gives you the safety, the knowing of who you are as you know yourself to be right now. So beyond the ego I, we meet our soul. And when our soul is attuned to the divine light and sound stream, this signals a sign, a voice towards God. This is where God's grace can pour through and reach us. You see, Sant Guru Kabir, he first bestowed this divine light and sound stream upon humanity. This was the gift that Sant Kabir has gifted to the human race. Because when attuned, a soul is marked as God's. The soul is not lost anymore. So all souls will eventually be redeemed and guided back home. And it is when the soul is ripened, when the soul is ready, God's grace can redeem a soul and release it forever from its bondage, from all the limitations to the most subtle limitations, all of them. Liberation is granted. One transcends the bondage of these cycles of birth and death, not because this vessel will live eternally, but because one soul now knows who it truly is. And when the soul awakens to see the truth of what it truly is, then the soul transcends the cycle of birth and death, because the soul now knows that it is eternal. So it doesn't function from the reality of this vessel. The dropping off of this vessel does not signify death at all. So this is why one is liberated by God's grace at this level. So with God's grace, one can be emancipated while still living. Thus, while good deeds are helpful for burning karmas, but liberation comes through the grace of God. So in Sant Mat, we read about God's grace and mercy and the manifestation in human form. Grace means unmerited favor, free or undeserved kindness shown by God, regardless of what we have or have not done. Mercy means forgiveness or compassion given to us by God for something we have done, the good merits. We need and receive grace because we cannot achieve anything worldly or spiritually on our own.